The morning of June 15th started like any other day at Kensington Palace. The sun was barely rising over London when the royal guards took their positions along the palace gates. Among them stood Officer Marcus Bellingham. A decorated guard with 12 years of impeccable service to the crown, he had protected members of the royal family through countless public events, state dinners, and private gatherings. His record was spotless, his dedication unquestionable. Marcus adjusted his bearskin hat, straightened his red tunic as he took his post near the main entrance. The morning air was crisp, and tourists were already beginning to gather outside the gates, cameras ready to capture the famous guards in their ceremonial uniforms. Marcus had grown accustomed to the attention, the photographs, and the occasional attempt by visitors to make him smile or break his stoic pose. He remained perfectly still, eyes forward, embodying the discipline and professionalism expected of the King's Guard. Inside the palace, Prince William was preparing for a busy day of royal duties. He had meetings scheduled with various charitable organizations, followed by a public appearance at a local community center. The Prince of Wales had always taken his responsibilities seriously, understanding that every action he took reflected not just on himself, but on the entire monarchy. As he reviewed his schedule with his private secretary, he glanced out the window at the guards below. Appreciating their dedication to protecting his family around mid-morning, something unusual caught the attention of palace staff. A young woman approached the gates repeatedly, trying to get the attention of Marcus Bellingham. She wasn't like the typical tourists who attempted to distract the guards for entertainment. There was an urgency in her movements, a desperation in her eyes. She called out to Marcus several times, but he maintained his position as protocol demanded. The guards were trained to ignore all distractions, no matter how persistent. What the staff and other guards didn't immediately notice was that Marcus had subtly shifted his stance. His eyes, which should have remained fixed straight ahead, flickered toward the woman. There was recognition there, connection that shouldn't have existed between a guard on duty and a civilian outside the gates. The woman held up her phone, showing Marcus something on the screen. Though his face remained expressionless, those paying close attention could see the tension in his jaw, the slight tremor in his gloved hands. A senior palace security officer noticed the interaction and immediately radioed to the command center. This was highly irregular. Guards were not supposed to acknowledge anyone while on duty, especially not in such a focused, personal manner. The security protocols were clear and existed for good reason. Any breach could represent a security risk to the royal family. Prince William happened to be walking through the corridor near the security office when he heard the radio chatter. His protective instincts, honed by years of security briefings and awareness of potential threats, kicked in immediately. He asked what was happening, and the security chief explained the situation with Marcus and the unknown woman. Without hesitation, William made his way to a window overlooking the gates. From his vantage point, the prince could see Marcus and the woman clearly. The guard's attention was divided, his focus compromised. In that moment, William knew he had to act. Security breaches, no matter how minor they might seem, could never be tolerated. The safety of his family, including his wife Catherine and their 3 children, depended on every guard maintaining absolute vigilance. William picked up the security radio and gave a direct order. His voice was calm but firm, carrying the authority of his position. Marcus Bellingham was to be removed from his post immediately and escorted inside for questioning. There was no anger in William's tone, but there was no room for debate either. The decision was made. Within minutes, 2 senior guards approached Marcus. They spoke to him quietly, and he nodded, understanding immediately what was happening. He handed over his ceremonial rifle to another guard and walked toward the palace entrance. His head held high despite the shame of being removed from duty. The tourists outside barely noticed the change, but inside the palace walls, word spread quickly. A guard had been dismissed by Prince William himself. Marcus was led to a small office where palace security officials waited. The woman from outside the gates had been brought in as well, though she was kept in a separate room. As Marcus sat down, removing his bearskin hat and placing it on the table, he finally allowed emotion to show on his face. It was a mixture of regret, fear, and something deeper. Something that spoke to a personal crisis beyond a simple protocol violation. The head of security began the questioning. But it was Prince William's presence in the doorway that made Marcus's situation feel even more serious. The prince didn't enter the room immediately, but his arrival signaled that this matter had his personal attention. For a guard who had spent over a decade protecting the royal family, seeing the disappointment in William's eyes was more painful than any official reprimand could be. Marcus took a deep breath and began to explain. The woman outside was his sister, Emma. They had been estranged for 3 years following a family dispute that had torn their small family apart. Marcus had joined the royal guard, partly to distance himself from the pain of that broken relationship, throwing himself into his duty with complete dedication. He hadn't spoken to Emma in all that time, hadn't even known where she was living. But that morning, Emma had received devastating news. Their elderly mother, the woman who had raised them both alone after their father's death, had suffered a massive stroke. She was in hospital, barely clinging to life, and the doctors said she had only hours, perhaps a day at most. Emma had tried calling Marcus dozens of times, but palace security protocols meant guards on duty had their personal phones locked away. Desperate and running out of time, she had come to the palace, hoping to reach her brother before it was too late. As Marcus spoke, his voice cracked. He explained that when he saw Emma outside the gates, he knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. Sisters don't appear at your workplace in tears unless something catastrophic has happened. But his training, his sense of duty, his commitment to the protocols he had followed flawlessly for 12 years held him in place. He tried to ignore her, tried to maintain his post. But when she held up her phone, showing him a photo of their mother in the hospital bed, tubes and wires everywhere, he couldn't help but react. The security officers listened, their expressions softening slightly, but rules were rules. Prince William, still standing in the doorway, absorbed every word. His face was unreadable, but those who knew him well could see the conflict playing out behind his eyes. Here was a dedicated guard who had broken protocol. Yes, but for reasons that touched something deeply human, deeply universal. The love between a son and his dying mother. The bond between siblings that even years of estrangement couldn't completely break. William stepped fully into the room and asked Marcus a direct question. Why hadn't he requested emergency leave through proper channels? Marcus's answer was simple and heartbreaking. He had requested leave 2 months earlier to attend his mother's birthday, but it had been denied due to staffing shortages during a busy period of royal engagements. He had assumed that any request now, especially during another busy period, would also be denied. He thought he would have to wait until his shift ended in 6 hours, and by then, it might be too late. So when Emma appeared, when he saw the desperation in her eyes and the evidence on her phone, his human heart overrode his guard's discipline for just a few moments. The room fell silent. Everyone present understood the weight of what had happened and what would come next. Prince William looked at Marcus Bellingham with an expression that was hard to read. The silence in the room stretched on, heavy with anticipation. Marcus sat rigidly in his chair, still wearing most of his ceremonial uniform, waiting for the judgment that would surely end his career. He had broken protocol, and there was no disputing that fact. In the royal guard, discipline was everything. Without it, the entire security apparatus could crumble. William finally spoke, his voice measured and calm. He thanked the security officers for their quick response and their professionalism. Then he did something unexpected. He asked everyone except Marcus to leave the room. The security chief hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with leaving the prince alone with a guard who had just been removed from duty. But William's look made it clear this wasn't a request. One by one, the officers filed out, closing the door behind them. Once they were alone, William pulled out a chair and sat across from Marcus. The formality of the situation shifted slightly. This was no longer just a prince addressing a guard who had failed in his duty. This was one man looking at another, seeing beyond the uniform and the protocol to the human being underneath. William asked Marcus about his mother. What was her name? How long had she been ill? What were the doctors saying? Marcus, surprised by the personal nature of the questions, answered haltingly at first, then with growing emotion. His mother, Dorothy, was 78 years old. She had worked as a nurse for 40 years, caring for others before she could no longer care for herself. The stroke had been sudden and severe. The doctors were not optimistic about her recovery, and even if she survived, she would likely never be the same, as Marcus spoke about his mother. About her kindness and her sacrifice, William listened intently. Those close to the prince knew that family meant everything to him. He had lost his own mother, Princess Diana, when he was just 15 years old. That loss had shaped him profoundly, teaching him the preciousness of time with loved ones and the pain of regret. He understood, perhaps better than most, what Marcus was facing. William made a decision. He stood up and told Marcus to go to the hospital immediately. There would be no formal disciplinary hearing, no drawn-out investigation. Marcus needed to be with his mother, and he needed to be there now. The prince would personally ensure that Marcus's absence was covered and that he faced no punishment for leaving his post. In fact, William would arrange for palace transportation to get Marcus to the hospital as quickly as possible. Marcus was stunned. He had expected to be fired, possibly even face legal consequences for his breach of duty. Instead, the future King of England was showing him mercy and understanding. Tears welled up in the guard's eyes as he thanked William repeatedly. The prince simply nodded, placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, and told him to go be with his family. Some things, William said, were more important than protocol. Within 20 minutes, Marcus was in a palace car speeding toward the hospital where his mother lay dying. His sister Emma sat beside him, still shocked by the turn of events. She had come to the palace expecting to be turned away, perhaps even arrested for causing a disturbance. Instead, the future king had intervened personally to help them. It seemed almost impossible to believe. At the hospital, Marcus and Emma rushed to their mother's bedside. Dorothy was unconscious, her breathing assisted by machines, her face pale and drawn, but she was still alive. A nurse told them that she had been asking for her children, that she had been distressed about the estrangement between her son and daughter. Now, seeing them both there together, standing on either side of her bed, holding her hands, the nurse felt a sense of peace settle over the room. Marcus spent the next 18 hours at his mother's bedside. He held her hand, told her about his work, about the places he had traveled with the royal family, about the things he had seen. Emma shared stories too, filling the gaps of the 3 years they had been apart. Slowly, painfully, the brother and sister began to rebuild the bridge that had collapsed between them. Their mother, though unable to respond, seemed to sense their presence. Her vital signs stabilized slightly when they spoke to her. Meanwhile,
back at Kensington Palace,
the story of what had happened began to spread. Palace staff whispered about Prince William's compassionate decision. Some praised him for his humanity and understanding. Others, however, were less approving. They worried about the precedent it set. If guards could break protocol and face no consequences, what did that mean for security? Where would the line be drawn? The concern reached higher levels of the royal household. Senior advisors and security chiefs requested a meeting with Prince William to discuss the matter. They understood his compassion, they said, but they also had to consider the broader implications. The Royal Guard operated on strict discipline for vital reasons. Every guard needed to know that protocol was absolute, that there were no exceptions, or else the entire system could break down. William listened to their concerns carefully. He understood their point of view and didn't dismiss it. Security was paramount, especially in an age where threats against the royal family came from many directions. But he also believed that humanity and compassion had their place, even within rigid systems. He argued that showing understanding in extraordinary circumstances didn't weaken the system, but rather strengthened the loyalty and dedication of those who served. The debate within the palace walls grew more intense over the following days. Some staff members felt William had been right to show mercy. They pointed out that Marcus had an otherwise perfect record and that his breach had been motivated by love for his dying mother, not negligence or malice. Others insisted that rules existed for reasons and that bending them, no matter how good the reason, created dangerous precedents. Word of the incident eventually leaked to the press. A junior staff member, speaking anonymously, shared the story with a tabloid journalist. Within days, Newspapers were running headlines about Prince William removing a guard from duty, though the full context wasn't initially clear. Some reports painted William as harsh and unfeeling, removing a dedicated guard at a moment of personal crisis. These articles quoted unnamed sources who were critical of the prince's actions. When the fuller story emerged, including William's decision to send Marcus to his mother's bedside and his compassionate treatment of the guard, public opinion began to shift. Many people praised William for his humanity and his ability to see beyond protocol to the human being in distress. Social media filled with comments supporting the prince's decision, with many sharing their own stories of losing parents and the importance of being there in those final moments. However, the positive public reaction only intensified the debate within the royal household. Senior advisors worried that the media attention was creating exactly the kind of precedent problem they had feared. If guards and staff members now believed they could bypass protocol and appeal to royal family members for special treatment, it could undermine the entire command structure that kept the household running smoothly and safely. A formal meeting was called, bringing together senior members of the royal staff, security chiefs, and Prince William himself. The atmosphere was tense. Charts and protocols were presented showing the careful security architecture that protected the royal family. Statistics were cited about previous breaches and their consequences. The message was clear. Compassion was admirable. But it couldn't come at the expense of safety and order. William defended his decision firmly, but without arrogance. He acknowledged the importance of protocol and security. He had lived under their protection his entire life and understood their necessity better than most. But he also argued that systems meant to serve humanity should never become so rigid that they crushed human dignity and compassion. Marcus Bellingham had not abandoned his post for frivolous reasons. He hadn't been negligent or corrupt. He had simply been a son desperately wanting to see his dying mother one last time. The meeting ended without full resolution. But a compromise began to take shape. New protocols would be developed to handle emergency family situations. Guards would be given a clearer path to request emergency leave, and shift supervisors would have more authority to make quick decisions in extraordinary circumstances. It wasn't perfect, but it was an attempt to balance security needs with human compassion. 3 days after Marcus had been removed from his post, his mother Dorothy passed away peacefully with both her children at her bedside. Marcus and Emma had reconciled fully by then, their old grievances seeming petty in the face of their shared loss. Dorothy's final gift to her children had been bringing them back together, and Marcus knew he had Prince William to thank for making that reunion possible. The story, however, was far from over, and the consequences of that morning's decision would continue to ripple through the royal household in ways no one had anticipated. The funeral for Dorothy Bellingham was held on a quiet Thursday morning at a small church in South London. It was a modest affair, attended by family, friends, and former colleagues from the hospital where she had worked for so many years. Marcus stood beside his sister Emma, both of them dressed in black, their grief visible but contained. They had spent the past week planning the service, reconnecting, and sharing memories of the woman who had raised them with such dedication and love. What surprised everyone at the funeral, including Marcus himself, was the appearance of a palace representative. A senior aide arrived, carrying a wreath of white lilies, with a card signed by Prince William expressing his condolences. The gesture was unexpected and deeply moving. It showed that William's compassion had not been a momentary impulse, but a genuine expression of care that extended beyond the immediate crisis. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the kindness, knowing that the prince had taken time from his busy schedule to acknowledge the loss of a guard's mother back at Kensington Palace. However, the situation was becoming increasingly complicated. The media coverage of Marcus's story had sparked a wider conversation about working conditions and protocols within the royal household. Journalists began investigating other incidents, where staff members had faced strict disciplinary measures for what seemed like minor infractions. Stories emerged of maids who had been reprimanded for being minutes late, drivers who had been suspended for small navigation errors, and kitchen staff who had been dismissed for serving food that wasn't precisely to specification. One particularly damaging story came From a former palace housekeeping supervisor named Margaret Chen. She had worked at Buckingham Palace for 15 years before being let go 3 years earlier. Margaret told reporters that she had been fired after requesting time off to care for her husband, who had been diagnosed with terminal cancer. Her request had been denied due to an upcoming state visit. When she had taken the time off anyway, she was dismissed for breach of contract. Margaret had never spoken publicly about her experience before, but Marcus's story had given her the courage to come forward. Other former employees began sharing similar tales. A gardener who had been dismissed after his daughter's emergency surgery caused him to miss work during a royal garden party. A security officer who had been suspended for falling asleep during a night shift after working 3 consecutive double shifts to cover for colleagues. A chef who had been fired after a severe allergic reaction caused him to leave his station during a formal dinner preparation. The pattern that emerged painted a picture of a royal household that was often inflexible and sometimes cruel in its treatment of staff. The media dubbed it the royal household scandal, and the coverage was relentless. Television programs featured interviews with former employees. Newspapers ran exposes about working conditions behind palace walls. Social media campaigns began calling for reforms to employment practices within the royal household. The hashtag royal reform began trending, with thousands of people sharing their opinions about how the monarchy treated the people who served it. The contrast between Prince William's compassionate treatment of Marcus and the harsh treatment other staff members had received became a central point of criticism. Critics argued that while William's personal kindness was admirable, it highlighted the systemic problems within the institution. Why should workers have to hope for the personal intervention of a royal family member to receive basic human dignity? Why wasn't there a system in place that automatically provided compassion and flexibility for staff facing family emergencies? Inside the palace, the mood grew increasingly tense. Senior advisors who had initially criticized William's decision to help Marcus now found themselves defending the entire royal household against accusations of cruelty and inflexibility. They scrambled to respond to the media coverage, issuing statements about the importance of protocol and the need for high standards in royal service. But their explanations sounded hollow. In the face of the human stories being shared by former employees, Prince William watched the unfolding situation with growing concern and frustration. What he had intended as a simple act of compassion had exposed deep problems within the institution he would one day lead. He began to realize that his decision to help Marcus had been right, but it had also revealed how wrong the system was that made such personal intervention necessary in the first place. The prince requested detailed reports on employment practices. He wanted to know about dismissal rates, the reasons for terminations, how emergency leave requests were handled, and what support systems existed for staff facing personal crises. The reports that came back were sobering. They revealed a pattern of rigid enforcement of rules, with little room for individual circumstances or human compassion. Catherine, Princess of Wales, joined her husband in reviewing the reports. She had always been conscious of the staff who supported their household, often going out of her way to learn their names, ask about their families, and show appreciation for their work. Reading about how some staff members had been treated shocked and saddened her. She and William began discussing what changes they could advocate for within the system. The couple decided to take action. They called meetings with senior household staff and began proposing reforms. They suggested creating an emergency leave policy that would allow staff to request immediate time off for family crises without fear of dismissal. They proposed establishing a staff welfare office that could advocate for workers and ensure their voices were heard. They recommended implementing a system of progressive discipline that would consider context and circumstances before jumping to termination. However, their proposals met significant resistance. Many senior advisors argued that the royal household had functioned with its current systems for decades, if not centuries. Changing protocols too quickly could destabilize operations and potentially compromise security. They warned that being too lenient with staff could lead to abuse of privileges and deterioration of the high standards that royal service required. The generational divide within the palace became apparent. Older staff members, many of whom had served under previous monarchs, tended to favor traditional approaches to discipline and protocol. They believed that strict rules and swift consequences were essential to maintaining the dignity and efficiency of royal service. Younger staff members, however, were more sympathetic to William and Catherine's reform proposals. They argued that treating employees with more compassion and flexibility would actually increase loyalty and improve service, not undermine it. Meanwhile, Marcus Bellingham found himself at the center of a controversy he had never wanted or expected. Journalists sought him out for interviews, which he declined. Former colleagues contacted him asking if he had experienced other instances of harsh treatment, which he hadn't. Marcus had always been treated fairly during his 12 years of service, right up until the moment he broke protocol to learn about his mother's condition. He didn't want to be a symbol of injustice within the royal household, because that wasn't his experience. But Marcus also couldn't ignore the stories other former staff members were sharing. He reached out to Margaret Chen, the former housekeeping supervisor who had been fired for caring for her dying husband. Hearing her story broke his heart. She had lost both her husband and her career, facing financial hardship on top of emotional devastation. Marcus couldn't help but think that if Prince William had been aware of her situation, he might have helped her just as he had helped Marcus. The question was, why should anyone have to rely on the personal intervention of a royal family member to receive basic compassion? Marcus made a difficult decision. He agreed to give one interview to a respected journalist. Not to criticize the royal family, but to add his voice to the call for systemic reforms. In the interview, he was careful and respectful. He praised Prince William's kindness and expressed deep gratitude for the compassion he had been shown. But he also acknowledged that other staff members had not been so fortunate, and he supported the idea of creating better systems to protect all workers. In the royal household, the interview was published on a Sunday morning and immediately became the most read article on several news websites. Marcus's balanced approach, his obvious respect for the royal family, combined with his support for reform, resonated with readers. Even critics of the monarchy found it hard to dismiss his perspective. He wasn't a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind. He was a dedicated professional who had been shown kindness, and now wanted that same kindness to be available to everyone who'd served the crown. The pressure on the royal household to respond became overwhelming. Buckingham Palace released a statement acknowledging that employment practices were being reviewed and that the well-being of staff was a priority, but the statement felt generic and inadequate given the scope of the concerns being raised. People wanted to see concrete actions, not just vague promises. Prince William knew that meaningful change would take time and would face continued resistance from within the establishment. But he also knew that this moment represented an opportunity to modernize the institution and make it more humane. The question was whether the entrenched forces of tradition would allow the changes needed to prevent future injustices. 6 weeks after Marcus Bellingham had been removed from his post at Kensington Palace, a significant announcement was made. The royal household would be implementing a comprehensive review of all employment practices, protocols, and staff welfare systems. The review would be conducted by an independent panel that included employment law experts, human resources professionals, and representatives chosen by current staff members. Most importantly, the review would have real authority to recommend binding changes, not just suggest improvements that could be ignored. Prince William and Catherine personally announced the review during a staff gathering at Buckingham Palace. William spoke directly to the hundreds of employees assembled, acknowledging that recent events had revealed problems that needed to be addressed. He didn't mention Marcus by name, but everyone knew what he was referring to. The prince spoke about the importance of balancing tradition with compassion, discipline with dignity, and efficiency with humanity. His words were carefully chosen, respectful of the institution, while still pushing for change. What made the announcement particularly powerful was Catherine's contribution. She spoke about the staff members she had gotten to know over the years, the dedication they showed, and the sacrifices they made. She acknowledged that asking people to serve the royal family with excellence and loyalty meant the royal family had an obligation to serve those people with fairness and compassion in return. Her speech was emotional and genuine, and it resonated deeply with the staff members present. The response to the announcement was mixed. Current staff members were cautiously optimistic, hoping that real changes would come, but not entirely convinced until they saw concrete results. Former employees who had been treated harshly expressed skepticism, noting that the palace had made promises of reform before that hadn't materialized. Media commentators debated whether this was genuine progress or just damage control in response to negative publicity. The independent review panel began its work immediately. It conducted confidential interviews with current and former staff members, gathering stories and identifying patterns. What they discovered was troubling, but not entirely surprising. The royal household operated under layers of bureaucracy where individual managers had significant power but little oversight. Staff members often had no clear path to appeal decisions or report unfair treatment. Emergency leave policies varied wildly between different departments and residences. Some staff members had excellent working conditions and supportive supervisors, while others worked in environments that were rigid, punishing, and emotionally exhausting. One of the most significant findings was that many of the harshest treatments occurred not because of deliberate cruelty, but because of a culture where protocol and tradition were valued above individual circumstances. Supervisors felt pressured to maintain impossibly high standards and believed that showing flexibility or compassion would be seen as weakness. The result was an environment where minor mistakes could end careers and personal crises were viewed as inconvenient disruptions rather than legitimate human needs. Marcus Bellingham was invited to speak with the review panel, shared his experience honestly, including both the positive aspects of his 12 years of service and the systemic issues that had nearly prevented him from being with his mother in her final hours. He spoke about the culture of fear that existed among some staff members, the reluctance to request help or accommodation because of concerns about being seen as uncommitted or unprofessional. Margaret Chin, the former housekeeping supervisor, who had been fired for caring for her dying husband, also testified. Her story was particularly powerful because she had been an exemplary employee for 15 years before her dismissal. The panel members were visibly affected by her account of begging her supervisor for just 3 days to be with her husband, only to be told that the upcoming state visit was more important than her personal tragedy. She described returning to work after her husband's funeral, exhausted and grieving, only to be called into an office and terminated for abandoning her duties. The review panel also discovered instances of staff members who had been treated with exceptional kindness and flexibility. These cases usually involved direct intervention by members of the royal family or particularly compassionate senior staff members. The inconsistency was stark. Whether someone was treated with humanity or harsh rigidity often depended on which supervisor they reported to, or whether their situation happened to come to the attention of someone with the authority and inclination to help. After 3 months of investigation, the review panel presented its findings and recommendations. The report was extensive, numbering over 200 pages. But its core message was clear. The royal household needed to modernize its approach to human resources and create systems that protected staff members while maintaining the high standards necessary for royal service. The recommendations included establishing a formal emergency leave policy that would allow staff members to request immediate time off for family crises, decisions made within hours rather than days or weeks. The report called for creating an independent staff advocacy office that could receive complaints, investigate concerns, and ensure fair treatment. It recommended implementing progressive discipline systems that would consider context and circumstances before moving to termination. Perhaps most significantly, it suggested mandatory training for all supervisors on compassionate leadership and the importance of treating staff with dignity. The royal household accepted the vast majority of the panel's recommendations. Implementation began immediately, starting with the establishment of the emergency leave policy and the staff advocacy office. Training programs were developed and scheduled. Employment contracts were revised to include stronger protections for workers. The changes were substantial and represented the most significant reform of royal household employment practices in generations. Marcus Bellingham was offered his position back with the Royal Guard. The offer came with a personal letter from Prince William, thanking him for his service and acknowledging the role his situation had played in prompting necessary reforms. Marcus was deeply moved by the offer and the letter. He spent days considering whether to return to his post. In the end, Marcus decided to accept the offer and return to service. He felt that walking away would suggest he was ashamed of what had happened, when in reality he was grateful for how events had unfolded despite the difficulty. His return to duty was quiet and without ceremony, exactly as he preferred. But his fellow guards knew what he represented, the idea that service to the crown didn't require sacrificing your humanity or abandoning your loved ones in their moments of greatest need. The media coverage of the reforms was extensive and generally positive. While some critics argued that the changes didn't go far enough or came too slowly, most observers acknowledged that significant progress had been made. The royal family's approval ratings, which had dipped during the scandal, began to recover. More importantly, the relationship between the royal household and its staff began to improve as workers felt more valued and protected. Margaret Chen received an unexpected phone call one afternoon. It was from the Royal Household Human Resources Office, offering her a formal apology for her treatment and a financial settlement that acknowledged the injustice of her dismissal. The representative explained that while they couldn't undo the past, they wanted to make amends and hoped she would accept their sincere regret. Margaret was overwhelmed with emotion. The apology and compensation couldn't bring back her husband or erase the pain she had suffered, but they represented acknowledgement that she had been wronged. It meant more to her than she could express. Other former staff members who had been treated harshly also received apologies, and in some cases, compensation. The royal household established a process for reviewing past dismissals and disciplinary actions to identify cases where staff members had been treated unfairly. It was a painstaking process, but it represented a genuine effort to address past wrongs while building a better system for the future. Prince William and Catherine continued to take personal interest in staff welfare. They made a point of regularly meeting with the staff advocacy office to hear about issues and concerns. They attended training sessions on the new policies to show their support and set an example for other senior household members. Their involvement made it clear that the reforms were not just public relations gestures, but genuine priorities backed by royal authority. The changes weren't universally welcomed. Some long-serving staff members felt that traditions were being abandoned and that the dignity of royal service was being diminished by making accommodations for personal issues. A few senior supervisors, who had been comfortable with the old system, found the new expectations uncomfortable and chose to retire rather than adapt. But these were minority voices, and over time, even many of the skeptics came to appreciate that treating staff with compassion didn't undermine excellence, but actually enhanced it. Marcus and Emma Bellingham established a small foundation in their mother's memory. It's dedicated to supporting healthcare workers facing family crises. The foundation provided emergency financial assistance and counseling services to nurses and other medical staff dealing with the illness or death of loved ones. It was their way of honoring Dorothy's life of service and ensuring that her legacy extended beyond her own family. The story of what happened that morning at Kensington Palace became something of a legend within the royal household. New staff members heard about it during their orientation, presented as an example of both the importance of protocol and the necessity of compassion. It represented a turning point, a moment when the rigid traditions of the past began to accommodate the human needs of the present. For Prince William, the experience reinforced his belief that the monarchy could only survive and remain relevant by evolving. Tradition and protocol had their place and their importance, but they couldn't be maintained at the expense of basic human decency. The institution he would one day lead needed to be both dignified and humane, both excellent and compassionate. The balance wasn't always easy to find, but it was essential. A year after Dorothy Bellingham's death, Koo stood at his post outside Kensington Palace on a morning very similar to the one when everything had changed. He maintained his stoic expression, his perfect posture, his unwavering focus. Tourists took his picture, children waved at him, hoping for a reaction. And life went on as it always had outside the palace gates. But inside those gates, something fundamental had shifted. Staff members now knew they could request emergency leave without fear of immediate dismissal. Workers had advocates they could turn to if they faced unfair treatment. Supervisors had been trained to balance standards with compassion. The changes weren't perfect, and challenges remained. But the royal household had taken significant steps toward becoming a more humane institution. As Marcus stood at his post, he thought about his mother and the legacy her life and death had created. Dorothy Bellingham had spent her career caring for others as a nurse, in a way she had never expected. Her final days had prompted changes that would improve the lives of countless workers within the royal household. She had brought her estranged children back together and had inadvertently exposed systemic problems that needed addressing. Her impact extended far beyond what she could have imagined. The aftermath of Prince William removing a guard from duty that morning had indeed shamed the entire royal household. It's not because of William's actions, but because of what those actions had revealed. The compassion he showed Marcus had highlighted how many others had not received such compassion, how the system had failed to protect those who served it faithfully. But from that shame had come genuine reform, meaningful change, and a renewed commitment to treating every person who served the crown with the dignity they deserved. The story served as a reminder that sometimes the most important changes come not from grand plans or official policies, but from individual acts of kindness that expose deeper truths. Prince William's decision to help one grieving guard had rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted, ultimately making the institution he served more just, more compassionate, and more worthy of the loyalty it demanded from those in its service.